A grandfather, pregnant, by his own grandson. This isn't a twisted fable from ancient times, nor some bizarre urban legend. It happened in America, among men so isolated the outside world forgot they even existed. Picture it. Rough cabins, silent valleys, and bloodlines looping back on themselves until brothers became fathers, fathers became uncles, and a grandson carried the seed of his own grandfather. It's a story that was buried under shame, whispered in dark corners, then used by lawmakers as proof of what happens when isolation closes men off from the wider world. But the truth isn't just scandal, it's survival, grief, and a tragedy bound in male blood. If stories like this fascinate you, hit like, subscribe, and share. It helps more curious minds discover forgotten tales of men pushed to extremes. Stick around. You won't want to miss what comes next. The story begins with a grandfather named Abram, born into hills where the outside world rarely arrived. He grew beneath trees older than memory, in a house built by uncles whose bones now rested under stone markers. Abram's father, Elias, was already twice the cousin of his own brother, Jacob. Their fathers had been first cousins, too. In this way, the pearl line folded in upon itself, generation after generation of men binding tighter. Wars raged elsewhere, but hunger ruled the hills. The clan of men lived by planting, hunting, and carving out cabins from cedar trunks. Marriages happened only among cousins, never outsiders, because there were no outsiders to be found. By 16, Abram had already buried 3 younger brothers, each lowered into the earth before learning to walk. Local men whispered the family line carried curses, though none dared say it aloud. To them, blood simply stayed within blood. At 17, Abram was given to his second cousin, Caleb Macaulay. They called each other brothers as much as husbands, for in those hills, lines blurred easily. Together, they built a dog-trot cabin and vowed to raise sons. The first child arrived lifeless, jaw clenched tight, body stiff in Abram's arms. He placed the boy into a wooden box and buried him beneath a walnut tree, whispering prayers that sounded more like confessions. 2 more boys followed, each born small and frail. Neither survived winter's first snow. Abram stayed awake nights, burning candles until his eyes bled, pleading with heaven for mercy upon the sons he had not yet met. At last, a son came strong and loud. They named him Rowan, and the boy thrived on goat's milk and cornbread. Rowan laughed when thunder shook the cabin and ran barefoot through fields without fear. The joy did not last. Disease swept through the valley, stealing dozens of children. Rowan's twin brothers, Samuel and Silas, were both struck. Samuel died in delirium, leaving Silas alive but trembling in his right hand forever. Grief hardened Abram and Caleb into silence. They buried Samuel with a lock of blonde hair sealed in a tin, pressed into a Bible. The cabin walls seemed to shrink as sorrow grew heavy inside them. Rowan grew into a tall young man, admired for his steady voice and grace, but isolation meant every boy who sought to bond with him was also a cousin. "Better kin than stranger," Abram warned one evening. So Rowan joined with Elijah, his cousin, under a porch of tangled vines. No outsiders came. The 2 shared faces alike, eyes pale as river ice, noses narrow and sharp. Their bond strengthened the bloodline further inward. Within a year, Rowan and Elijah welcomed a son. His name was Jonah, a boy who cried weakly but endured. Abram wept holding him, torn between dread of curses and hope for salvation. For 5 years, Jonah thrived. He balanced on fence rails, chased grasshoppers, and memorized psalms. Yet his stare unsettled men who passed through, pupils distant, comprehension always half a breath behind, like seeing through broken glass. Tragedy struck again. Elijah, desperate for wages, took dynamite work at a quarry. A single careless spark stole his arm, his face, and his life after 3 agonizing days of bleeding pleas. Rowan followed him soon after. With Elijah buried and Rowan gone to earth, Jonah became an orphan. Caleb numbed himself with corn liquor, leaving Abram alone as guardian of Jonah and Silas, who trembled worse with each winter. The cabin's silence deepened. Abram raised Jonah as both grandson and son, fiercely protective, teaching him to trap rabbits, repair fences, and fear the world beyond the ridge. They survived together, two men bound by grief, blood, and a fate none could escape. What began as survival soon became entanglement. The bloodline of men had folded so many times upon itself that roles blurred: brother, father, uncle, son. And in that blur, the seeds of catastrophe quietly took root. The dog-trot cabin stood weathered by decades of storms, its cedar logs darkened with age. Built by Abram and Caleb, it echoed with the footsteps of sons and cousins long gone into shallow graves. Within its walls, men lived shoulder to shoulder, eating from the same iron pot, sleeping in narrow bunks, and whispering prayers into rafters blackened with smoke. The cabin was more fortress than home, binding them together. Each season followed the same rhythm: planting corn, gathering firewood, repairing roofs, and hunting deer across ridgelines. Men rose before dawn, muscles aching, yet duty forced them onward. There was no gentleness, only survival. Grief hung inside the cabin like fog. Abram kept silent about Rowan's death, Elijah's mangled body, or the infant boys who never drew full breath. Instead, he sharpened axes, mended traps, and spoke only in scripture. Jonah, growing older, absorbed this silence as inheritance. He learned to read ledgers by candlelight, studied psalms on brittle pages, and listened to Abram's warnings about outsiders who never brought mercy, only loss and ridicule. Silas, the surviving twin, carried his tremor with shame. His right hand shook uncontrollably, spoiling his ability to carve wood or aim a rifle. He left often for logging camps, but letters home arrived shaky and rare. When Silas vanished into far-off counties, the cabin shrank further. Abram and Jonah shared meals, worked fields, and patched leaks together. They spoke less and less, until words felt like luxuries neither man could afford. Isolation deepened their bond. Jonah stopped venturing beyond the creek bend. Abram called him my boy, though he was grandson, and Jonah called him Pa Gran, confusing bloodlines into a single knot of loyalty. At night, storms prowled the ridge, rattling warped shutters. Abram and Jonah shared a mattress near the stove, snow pressing against clapboards outside. Two men breathing in unison, one carrying youth, the other carrying years. Neighbors whispered about their solitude, suspicious of the way no outsiders crossed the yard. But the hills had long memories, and men there knew tragedy had already hollowed this cabin too many times. Jonah entered adolescence suddenly, shoulders broadening, voice deepening. He grew restless, pacing the yard after midnight, muttering to himself. Abram recognized the same shadowed moods that once haunted Caleb before liquor took him under. One autumn, Jonah vanished into woods for 2 days. When he returned, clothes torn, face streaked, he collapsed into Abram's lap, sobbing. "Something's wrong inside me, Pa Gran. I don't know where to place it." Abram stroked his hair, remembering his own father Elias muttering similar confessions decades before. He whispered promises, though empty, that strength could carry them through. Compassion overwhelmed caution. Abram had already lost too many sons. Winter sealed them tighter, snow buried fences, wind howled against walls, and the two remained indoors side by side, whispering psalms to keep silence from consuming them. Every hour, grief and closeness twisted tighter together. The cabin itself became witness. Its logs creaked under frost, hearth burned low, and shadows stretched long across walls. It seemed almost alive, a keeper of secrets too heavy for men to carry alone. Jonah's moods worsened. He spoke of unseen figures in corners, called names into darkness, and carved circles into his palms. Abram sat beside him quietly, unwilling to admit that something unnatural stirred inside their bond. Men in neighboring cabins noticed Abram stopped attending gatherings at the chapel. They guessed sorrow chained him. None suspected how blurred roles of father, grandfather, and son had already collapsed into a single fragile identity. The cabin of men endured through hunger, storms, and suspicion, but beneath its roof, boundaries bent. What began as survival between grandfather and grandson now teetered on the edge of something the hills would never forgive. The lineage of Abram carried sorrow like a second skin. Generations of men were born, but most never reached manhood. Wooden boxes beneath walnut trees marked more graves than living kin within the cabin. Neighbors spoke in whispers of the Pearl and Macaulay men. Cousins bound as brothers, fathers buried sons, uncles raising nephews as sons of their own. Bloodlines spiraled so tightly the branches could hardly stretch outward. Abram remembered Elias, his own father, digging shallow graves in frozen ground. He remembered Jacob weeping beside him, hands bleeding on shovels. Loss was tradition. To bury boys was as certain as planting corn. Rowan's death had hollowed Abram most of all. A son who had grown tall, admired by cousins, admired even by rival clans. Yet fever stole him in a single violent summer, leaving silence behind. Jonah grew beneath this silence. By age 10, he understood that joy was fleeting, that every laugh was shadowed by mourning. He asked Abram why God gave sons only to steal them away. Abram had no answers. He quoted Psalms and repeated verses, but even Scripture faltered in the face of constant funerals. His Bible carried locks of hair from brothers, uncles, and sons, now dust beneath roots. Silas still wandered between camps, unable to stay long at the cabin. His trembling hand betrayed him, and wages came sparse. When he returned, he stared long at the walnut tree, remembering Samuel's grave. The men lived with reminders everywhere. A pair of boots sat untouched by the hearth, belonging to Elijah. A carved whistle, once Rowan's, hung from a peg. These relics were ghosts filling the cabin air. Jonah inherited the grief in strange ways. Sometimes he laughed suddenly, too loudly, startling Abram. Other times he spoke of hearing voices from the loft rafters, calling him by names of brothers long buried. Abram feared madness was their legacy. He recalled Elias muttering at shadows, Jacob rocking on porches whispering to no one. Perhaps blood so twisted could not escape sorrow without cracking the mind in half. Despite this, Abram clung to Jonah fiercely. He could not bear to lose another son or grandson. He worked Jonah hard in fields, hoping sweat and toil would anchor him away from despair. Jonah's eyes, pale and distant, unsettled the men who passed through. A preacher once said looking into Jonah's gaze was like staring through shattered glass, seeing eternity jagged and fractured. Abram struck the man for speaking it. One winter, hunger gnawed worse than usual. Crops failed, game thinned. Abram and Jonah shared thin broth, counting every kernel of corn. Sorrow deepened into desperation, testing how much loss one cabin of men could withstand. Silas wrote letters that rambled, lines crooked with his tremor. He spoke of missing brothers, of hearing Samuel's laughter in dreams. His words carried more absence than presence, haunting Abram each time he read them. Jonah grew restless in these conditions. He often walked to the graves, tracing names with his fingers, whispering to unmarked stones as though holding conversations. Abram watched silently, too broken to scold or forbid. Every death weighed heavier upon them, compressing the cabin into something smaller than walls. It became a shrine of absence, where men carried grief like heirlooms, passed down as faithfully as blood itself. By adolescence, Jonah had never known a life untouched by death. For every lesson in hunting or carpentry, there was another in digging graves or memorizing prayers. Sorrow wasn't exception. It was the only inheritance. And so the sons of sorrow carried forward. Abram, Jonah, Silas, each scarred by absence, bound by grief, and chained to a bloodline that grew tighter with each burial. Survival itself became the only rebellion left. In the hills, outsiders judged the Pearl and Macaulay men, but inside their cabins the rules were different. Kinship bound them tighter than law or church. Brothers often became husbands, cousins became fathers, uncles became sons. When Abram pressed Jonah's hand and told him, "Better kin than stranger," it was not advice but survival. No outsiders ever stayed long in the valley, leaving only cousins and brothers to continue the line. Elijah had once joined with Rowan under such customs, and though their bond resembled brothers more than anything else, the hills called it marriage. No one questioned it, for it was tradition born of necessity. Generations of men had done the same, circling back into their own blood, forging bonds that outsiders would call twisted, but insiders accepted as the only way. Brotherhood became fatherhood. Uncle became husband. Lines blurred beyond recognition. Jonah grew up watching this. He saw uncles living with cousins as husbands, cousins raising nephews as sons. The word brother carried more weight than any title, for it could mean father, partner, or both. Isolation forced these choices. There were no towns close enough, no strangers trusted enough. Men learned to accept that their blood would repeat itself, and so they embraced the cycle, regardless of whispers from preachers. One evening, Abram told Jonah about Elias and Jacob, who once joined together as cousins, raising sons who were both brothers and nephews. Abram spoke without shame, as though this was simply the law of the hills. Jonah listened, unsettled, but he saw no alternatives. Every story of his kin traced the same pattern: men binding to men, brothers turning into fathers, cousins becoming uncles. The bond was inescapable, the cycle unbroken. The cabin became witness to these unions. Carved beams above the hearth bore initials of brothers joined together, dates scratched in charcoal marking when cousins pledged to each other. Their history was inscribed directly into the walls. Abram feared outsiders discovering their truth. He warned Jonah never to speak of it beyond the ridge. "Men beyond here," he said, "call it sin, but here it is survival." Jonah nodded, unsure. Despite fear, bonds between brothers deepened. Men worked side by side, hunted as pairs, and lay down as partners. Trust was born of shared blood, and betrayal was unthinkable. In this, they found strength. Jonah, entering adolescence, began to feel the pull of this tradition. He resisted at first, pacing the cabin, restless and troubled. But isolation pressed him back toward Abram, toward the single bond left unbroken. The hills demanded closeness. Winters buried them together, storms raged outside, and silence pressed hard. In that silence, brotherhood blurred into something heavier. The bond between grandfather and grandson shifted, though neither dared name what it was. Men in neighboring cabins noticed Jonah's presence beside Abram constantly. They assumed the old man simply clung to his heir. None suspected the deeper entanglement that was forming in the shadows of the dog-trot cabin. The preacher still visited, speaking warnings of sin and decay. But his words fell flat against Abram, who had long seen sorrow rob him of sons. To Abram, blood itself was the only commandment left. Jonah began dreaming of his brothers and cousins, seeing their faces in flames, hearing their laughter in rain. He woke shaking, clinging to Abram, whispering he feared being alone more than he feared damnation. Abram, hardened by graves, offered only one truth: blood to blood, root to root. That is how it has always been. Jonah absorbed the words, though deep inside, terror and longing fought endlessly. And so, the bond of brothers carried forward, no longer merely kinship, but a cycle without escape. A grandson and grandfather stood at its center, bound not only by grief, but by blood twisted too tightly. Jonah's 6th year brought catastrophe. His father Elijah, desperate for wages, took dynamite work at the quarry. A single careless blast stole his arm, shattered his face, and dragged him into death after 3 agonized days. Rowan, already weakened by fever and grief, did not survive long either. Within weeks, he collapsed in his cabin, breath ragged, body consumed by sickness. Abram buried him beside Elijah beneath the walnut tree's shade. Loss fell like an avalanche. In one season, Jonah lost both father and grandfather turned father. He became an orphan at 6, clutching Abram's hand while the soil still clung fresh over 2 new graves. Caleb, worn thin by grief, numbed himself with corn liquor. He staggered through cedar groves at night, muttering scripture to the wind. One winter evening, he collapsed drunk beside the stove and never woke again. Within 8 months, Abram buried Rowan, Elijah, and Caleb. He was left with Jonah, barely a boy, and Silas, trembling worse each year. The dog-trot cabin became smaller, every room haunted by voices of the lost. Abram carried the burden alone. He became father, grandfather, and guardian all at once. He held Jonah fiercely, vowing not to lose him too. But sorrow made promises heavy, and survival grew uncertain. Jonah clung to Abram as though to a father. He called him Pa Gran, not fully understanding the difference anymore. The roles had blurred so much that names and bloodlines no longer carried clear meaning. Silas could not stay. Restless and ashamed of his tremor, he left for distant logging camps, promising wages but sending only rare, shaky letters. Abram and Jonah remained, 2 men, one old and one young. They worked fields together, mended fences, trapped rabbits, and patched leaks in the cabin roof. Life became survival stripped bare. Abram guided Jonah in every task, shaping him into the last hope of the line. Yet grief stalked them. Abram sometimes sat at graves for hours, whispering names of lost sons. Jonah followed, tracing carved stones with his small hands, asking questions Abram could not answer about why men kept dying. At 12, Jonah rarely wandered beyond the creek. Abram taught him that the outside world only brought harm. "Stay close," he warned. "Out there, they laugh at us. Here, blood is all that matters." The bond between them grew fierce. Jonah became Abram's shadow, repeating his words, mimicking his prayers, watching his every move. Abram, in turn, poured into Jonah all the love and sorrow he still carried. But adolescence struck suddenly. Jonah's voice deepened, shoulders broadened, and moods swung like loose gates. He paced the yard at night, fists clenched, whispering words Abram couldn't hear. Something restless stirred within him, and Abram feared it. One autumn, Jonah vanished into the woods for 2 days. When he returned, face torn, clothes ragged, he collapsed into Abram's lap, sobbing. "Something's wrong inside me, Pa Gran. I don't know where to place it." Abram stroked his hair, remembering Caleb muttering similar words before liquor destroyed him. He whispered reassurance, though empty, that Jonah would be safe. Compassion overpowered caution. Abram could not risk losing his grandson to despair. Winter closed in. Snow buried fences. Storms rattled the cabin walls. Abram and Jonah shared the feather mattress near the stove, pressed together against cold. Breath mingled, warmth shared, silence deepened. The line between roles bent further. Neighbors noticed Abram ceased attending chapel gatherings. They saw Jonah hovering at his side constantly. Whispers spread, but no proof existed. All they knew was that the cabin of men had grown even more withdrawn. The orphaned grandson had become inseparable from the grandfather who raised him. In the silence of snow and grief, their bond crossed lines no preacher could bless. It was survival, but it carried shadows of something darker. The first snow of that winter arrived heavy, bending fences beneath white weight. Abram and Jonah sealed themselves inside the cabin, fire crackling, knowing months of storms would lock them together without reprieve. Outside, the hills slept in silence. Inside, shadows stretched long across timbered walls. Abram felt the weight of eyes always upon him, Jonah's pale gaze watching, unsettled yet searching for something unnamed. Jonah's body had changed quickly, muscles broadening from labor, jaw sharpening under firelight. Yet his mind lagged behind, caught between boy and man. Abram sensed both innocence and hunger tangled inside his grandson's silence. Nights grew longer, cold pressing against walls. They shared a feather mattress close to the stove, breath mingling as frost crept along window panes. Bound by necessity, their closeness deepened into something neither man dared define. Jonah began muttering in sleep, calling out names of dead brothers, reaching toward empty air. Abram held him through shivering fits, whispering scripture, though even he doubted verses could calm the restless storm inside. The bond blurred further. Jonah no longer called Abram only grandfather, but father, brother, even partner in unguarded moments. Each title struck Abram like thunder, reminding him how tightly the bloodline had coiled inward. Neighbors grew suspicious. Abram avoided chapel gatherings, claiming sickness. Men whispered that something unnatural kept him inside, but law seldom stretched into such hills, and whispers were as powerless as the snow drifting endlessly. Jonah's moods worsened. He paced nights, fists clenched, jaw grinding. At times he wept without reason, collapsing into Abram's lap, confessing that his heart burned with feelings he couldn't place, emotions that frightened him more than hunger. Abram remembered Caleb confessing similar torment before liquor drowned him. He feared Jonah would suffer the same fate, wandering into madness. Out of pity and terror, he clung tighter, offering comfort rather than correction. Storms battered the ridge, shaking shutters loose. Abram and Jonah huddled together, whispering psalms until words slurred into murmurs. Silence grew thick, pressing them into one another as though the hills themselves demanded their union. When spring thawed snow, Jonah rarely left Abram's side. He hovered over him, tending fire, fetching water, patching roof leaks. Outsiders who glimpsed them saw a devotion deeper than blood, unsettling yet undeniable. One evening, a traveling preacher knocked, demanding why Abram no longer attended gatherings. Jonah stood at the door, silent, eyes pale and unreadable. The preacher left uneasy, muttering that shadows lived in that house. By midsummer, Abram's waist thickened. He blamed idleness, yet neighbors whispered other explanations. Jonah was often seen at his side, smoothing hair, guiding him to chairs, showing a tenderness that fueled suspicion without words spoken. Abram refused to name what was happening. He called it survival, the will of God, anything but sin. Jonah, when questioned, only muttered, "Blood to blood, root to root. That's how it's always been." Isolation shielded them from punishment. Lawmen never came, and neighbors lacked proof. The hills carried rumors like smoke, but smoke drifted, never settling. Still, whispers stained their names, carried across valleys by cautious tongues. As storms returned, Abram and Jonah again shared fire and mattress, their bond undeniable. It was no longer simply grandfather and grandson. It was something heavier, a shadow cast long over every stone in the graveyard. The winter of shadows had bound them completely. What began as necessity in cold nights had become entanglement. The line between survival and taboo vanished, leaving two men locked in a fate the world would never forgive. Rumors spread faster than streams in flood. Men whispered across ridges that Abram, old and weary, carried a child inside him. Jonah, always near his side, was accused in silence before any word spoken. The preacher raised his hand at chapel, declaring sin had rooted itself deep in Abram's cabin. Neighbors muttered, but none stepped forward with proof. Still, suspicion was enough to blacken their names. By spring, truth could no longer hide. Abram collapsed near the spring house, body heavy, breath ragged. A midwife was summoned, But when she lifted cloth, she saw what no man dared speak aloud. Abram lay swollen with life, 6 months along. His face shone with fever, lips whispering verses of mercy. Jonah stood nearby, pale eyes unblinking, muttering, "Blood to blood, root to root, always has been." Word traveled quick. Men gathered torches, some demanding justice, others too horrified to act. But law in the backcountry required evidence, and Abram swore no sin had been committed, only God's mysterious will at work. Jonah, silent in gatherings, revealed nothing. He hovered at Abram's bedside, wiping sweat, whispering songs half-remembered from childhood. Outsiders saw his tenderness and drew their conclusions. Accusation needed no confession. The truth lingered in gestures. By midsummer, Abram's time came. Thunder rolled above ridges, rain thrashed shingles, while his body convulsed in pain. Jonah clutched his hand, eyes wide, both terrified and devoted as screams filled the cabin. Hours passed before silence fell. A son was delivered but limp as wet cloth, skull misshapen, chest faintly fluttering. Abram held the boy close, calling him "my little mercy," until breath deserted both father and child. When dawn broke, Abram was gone. Jonah knelt in blood-soaked sheets, rocking silently, his mind shattered. For neighbors who entered later, the sight burned itself into memory, a horror that could never be erased. The coroner ruled deformities matched consanguinity, kin too close breeding with kin. Newspapers seized it. Headlines screamed, "Grandfather made pregnant by grandson. Hill tragedy shocks nation." Shame spread like wildfire, though attention faded quickly beyond the valleys. Jonah, only 17, was dragged before a judge. His stare seemed vacant, words stumbling. The court debated whether to call him criminal or victim, sinner or madman. In the end, he was sent away. The asylum swallowed him whole. Doctors labeled him Case 1132, prodding with inkblot tests, measuring skull shape, recording pale eyes, tremors, and vacant speech. To them, Jonah was proof of degeneracy, a tool for eugenics. Abram's name disappeared from records. Only Jonah remained, branded by law, by science, and by whispers. The cabin rotted, its roof caving, while the graves outside filled with rainwater and silence thicker than scripture. Lawmakers waved Jonah's file as evidence of bloodlines left unchecked. His tragedy became policy, fueling sterilization statutes. To the world, Jonah was no longer a boy. He was Exhibit A of genetic failure. Inside stone walls, Jonah wept at photographs of barns and cedar groves, memories of home. He traced circles on his palms endlessly, whispering names of Abram and the lost child only he remembered. Years passed. He wove rugs, shuffled through corridors, and stared through barred windows at skies he once chased barefoot. He grew older, bones thin, spirit cracked, but whispers of that trial still echoed in his mind. The trial of blood had ended with no verdict, only exile. Jonah became the living emblem of a family's collapse, not judged by his own choices, but by the twisted lineage carved into him. Jonah's years in the asylum aged him into a ghost. By 34, his hands trembled, his voice cracked, and his memories frayed. Authorities transferred him to a county poorhouse, another place of exile. There he met a man named Birdie Lou, a crippled washer with a laugh like bells. Birdie offered kindness Jonah hadn't known since Abram. For a short time, hope flickered in shadow. But when Birdie confessed Jonah's history to officials, believing honesty noble, they separated them. Birdie vanished into another institution, Jonah sent to a work camp. Their bond was severed, another mercy stolen by judgment. At the camp, Jonah laid railroad ties under the southern sun. His body grew sinewed, but his mind unraveled further. He muttered to shadows, calling them Abram, calling them the son who never lived. Foreman whispered of his strangeness. One evening, he carved air with a pocket knife, eyes glazed. begging unseen figures to return inside his blood. Pity spared him jail. He was discharged, given $5 and a coat. He drifted through parishes of Louisiana, working pecan groves, sleeping beneath trees. Locals told stories of a pale drifter with eyes like fish belly, speaking scripture mixed with lullabies, a man neither fully present nor gone. A hurricane pushed him north into Mississippi. WPA photographers caught his image on a levee, barefoot, hair matted, gaze vacant. The photo ran nationally, but readers saw only another nameless Dust Bowl casualty, not America's darkest scandal. By the 1930s, Jonah wandered Tennessee's mountains. He lived in an abandoned mill loft, chopping wood for a widowed bootlegger named Ezra. Rumors suggested closeness, but truth pointed to companionship without intimacy. Jonah feared intimacy as poison. Ezra's cough deepened into crimson rattles. Tuberculosis carried him away, leaving Jonah alone again. He carved Ezra's name into a dogwood trunk, then sat silent against it for days, speaking to no one. Loneliness drove him further adrift. Census men later found him in a tar paper shack, recording him as illiterate and widowed, though he still read Psalms. He scribbled widowed, perhaps thinking of Abram, perhaps thinking of loss itself. War came and Jonah labored at a munitions plant in Tennessee. Long shifts assembling shells destroyed his hearing, chemicals burned his lungs. He left half-deaf, wages withheld, slipping back into the forgotten stream of drifters. The 1950s brought him to a hospital barefoot on Route 66. Doctors misfiled him as a veteran, but one intern uncovered his past, publishing Jonah as a cautionary tale of consanguinity in medical journals. Officials realized Jonah had never been sterilized. In 1954, orderlies wheeled him into an operating room, performing vasectomy without consent. When told, he whispered, "Now the circle ends," accepting with resignation what law branded necessary. His last years were spent at a halfway farm in Texas, tending tomatoes. Other residents remembered him humming lullabies into the wind, speaking of clouds that carried faces of Abram, Elijah, and the son called Mercy. On October 11, 1961, Jonah died of cerebral hemorrhage in an iron bed. No kin claimed him. The state buried him beneath a marker reading simply, JM 1961, one more forgotten body in Potter's Field. Decades later, his asylum photo resurfaced in a dissertation. Scholars called him the most inbred man in America. Yet beneath headlines, Jonah remained a wanderer, a boy orphaned by sorrow, bound by bloodlines, crushed by isolation. The story of Jonah was never only about sin or scandal. It was about men left alone in silence, about bonds twisted by grief, about society turning away until tragedy was all that remained. So the last wanderer passed into legend. Jonah's tale warns that darkness thrives in silence, that isolation births catastrophe, and that forgotten men often carry the heaviest weight, until history digs up their bones for stories.